Go to TAPgiles.com to learn dreams, engage my services, and support the channel. I'd like to teach some things about animation optimization, in this case focusing on wires. This is a character a friend of mine is working on called Grit. This is actually an old version they've said I can use to demonstrate some things. And you can see that it's quite high on thermo, which was making it hard for them to add more animations and actions and such. But if we click on the gameplay thermo and then more info, we can see that the high number we are seeing is actually only coming from the wires and animation limit. Things is another sub-thermo limit we can see here, but it's currently used up less. So really the number of wires in the scene was the thing stopping them from adding more animations and abilities. And because that's the highest percentage out of these sub-thermos, that's the percentage it shows you back here. Each actual wire you place uses up this limit, but also animations use up this limit, because even though these keyframes don't show any wires normally, they have invisible wires. We can now see those invisible wires by going to Show Hide, and with the Wires option there's a new Invisible Connections toggle. With that on, we can select an object and it'll show all invisible wires connecting to it. Or selecting something with invisible wires, like a keyframe, it shows the wires coming from that keyframe. Other gadgets like an action recorder or a possession recorder also have invisible wires going to the things they recorded. Note that even for action recorders, where it's recorded lots of positions for the same object, it only uses one wire to hook into the position of the object, or whatever settings it's affecting. Now we can go into an animation of the character and see what's up with the wires in there. I've got 2 copies of this animation here so that we can compare our optimized version with the original later on. To get a sense of how much just this one animation is costing, I can delete the animation entirely and watch the thermo in the corner there to see how much it lowers by. In this case, that one animation costs 2% on gameplay thermo, or technically between 2 and 3%, and that's almost entirely on wires. So why is that? If I select just one keyframe, we can see it's got a good number of wires, which isn't ideal, but then if we select all the keyframes, here I'm double tapping X to select everything in the timeline, then it shows us all the wires coming out of all the keyframes, which makes it pretty clear that's a lot of wires. But where are they all going? If we select just one of them again, we can see most of them are hooked up to the character's limbs for the animation pose, but it's also turning off some of these procedural animation chips. And then the next keyframe is also turning off those same chips, and the next keyframe and the next, each using a whole new set of wires. That's 5 chips is affecting, which means 5 wires per keyframe in this animation. There are 12 keyframes, so that's 60 wires in total. And just to turn off those chips for the duration of the animation. If we had just one keyframe that turned off all the same chips, and we'll just have that keyframe last for that section, so we drag out the right side of it to be as long as we want. That costs one more thing, of course, but only uses 5 wires, as we can see here. But now these other keyframes don't need to worry about those chips at all. We can record into each of those and use triangle on those chips to forget about turning them off, and use L1 and right on the D-pad to skip to the next keyframe on the timeline, and forget those chips again. Once we've done that for all of the keyframes, we've saved a total of 55 wires for the cost of just one extra keyframe. I did the maths earlier and that saves 0.37% on wires just from that one simple change. You can even go one step further. Because the procedural animation stuff needs to be turned off for a lot of these animations, we'd need one of these keyframes copied into every one of those animations, using more wires. Unless we have just one keyframe sitting out here somewhere, and then we could use a switch in the animations to power it, which would be just one wire for each of those animations, instead of the 5 we'd have if we copy the keyframe into the other animations. Another way would be to just turn the keyframe off, and then use a keyframe to turn it on instead of a switch in the timeline. But again, it's just a single thing for the gadget, and a single hidden wire to turn it on, instead of another 5 per animation we copy it into. Now let's start optimizing the animation itself. In this early part of the animation, it actually looks like the arms and legs are in a similar pose, it's just that the pelvis is rotating around to spin the character. So we can do a similar optimization. Have a single keyframe setting the pose of the arms and legs so that it only uses one set of wires affecting the limbs, and other keyframes animating the pelvis to move the entire character around. To do that, I'll just place a keyframe here below the old one. While recording into this, the timeline will go to that time, so the old keyframe is active and the old pose is active. I can then just tap each body part with L2 to record its pose, apart from the pelvis, because we're going to split that out, as I said. Something to remember to check is the pose of the neck, which can be hidden away depending on the character. And we'll just have that keyframe last for that section, so we drag out the right side of it to be as long as we want. And that takes care of the limbs. And now we're going to have a keyframe at each of those spots to animate the pelvis, separately on its own row. And then quickly use L1 and X between the keyframes to add the same shape tweens. And now we actually record into them. This time we just tap the pelvis with R2 to record the same position as the old animation into the new keyframe. Then L1 and right on the D-pad to record into the next keyframe, and finish the rest of them in that section. A quick note while I'm here, if the feet are near the purple base of the puppet and you record the position of the pelvis, it will also record the position of the feet, for reasons. So you may need to use triangle to forget about the feet so that they're controlled by those other keyframes properly. Actually, if you want to be sure you get the exact same positions, you can turn on the grid. That will make it harder for your shaky hands to move things out of place. Now if we tweak the timeline and turn on the sidebar, we can turn off the old animation entirely and see how the new version looks. And swap them over to see the old one again. Yeah, they're pretty close. The limbs animation has been simplified a little, but it's not too noticeable, especially with all the other action happening while you're actually playing the game. But also we can add a second keyframe to adjust the pose slightly, like so. And easily have a very smooth transition for just a few more wires. Again, compared to the 20 or so per keyframe we had before. Then in this section, the pose is a little different. So let's transition to that. And the pose shifts a little over here. And then she drops to the ground. For this one, the feet want to stay locked to the ground, so instead of using L2 to rotate them, I'll use R2 to set their position. This avoids them moving around as the pelvis continues to animate, and can look better for landing poses. And then we animate the pelvis. And if we delete the old version from this timeline, we can now compare the original expensive animation and the new animation. I dare say an actual animator would finesse things more from here, but for a quick optimization, it's looking pretty good. and from some quick calculations, that saves a full 1% on wires, for an extra cost of just 0.03% on things, for the extra couple of keyframes. But that's just this one animation. Imagine optimizing all the other animations on this character in the same way. If you saved 1% on each animation, you'd have another 10 or 20% to work with for new animations and mechanics. That's why optimizing for thermo can be really helpful to get the most out of your game. I hope it helps you do the same. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something interesting. Go to patreon.com/TAPgiles to learn something new every day.